this is Torin Talks, and today's video is going to be all about shows you should be watching if you're missing your Game of Thrones fix. So with all this new Game of Thrones news that has been coming out, I thought I would recommend some shows that will kind of give you that Game of Thrones fix if you're kind of jonesing like me and you want something that's Game of Thrones related that kind of gets you in that same feel. So the first recommendation of my shows that'll fix your Game of Thrones needs is going to be The Last Kingdom. This show is currently on Netflix, and it is about a man who is named Uhtred of Bebbanburg, and he is like the lord of this land. He gets kidnapped by Vikings as a kid, and then the whole thing is about him regaining his lost kingdom of Bebbanburg in the north, in Northumberland in England. And the lead guy, Uhtred, he is super hot, like he's super cute. And the story, I kind of almost feel like it reminds me of Jax from Sons of Anarchy, if you know that character, but like in medieval. But the story also revolves around some other characters, and some of these people are like legendary figures from out British medieval or pre-medieval history.
You're Alfred.
I am. It is my hope all kingdoms will become united under one god.
One king.
I want the king! And I want him alive!
Asking men to join you. Is that what you would do? It's what a king would do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting show, and I really like the characters, and you get a little different of dynamic between like the Vikings and the way the English do things. And so it's a really interesting show, and the lead guy, I really like him, although sometimes he's very brash and hot-headed and stubborn and reckless. Right up my alley. The next show that I'm going to recommend is called Versailles. It's also a series, and it is also on Netflix. And this show is about Louis XIV. It's about the French court at Versailles. And Versailles is like one of the most fascinating kind of places for me personally. That's like on my bucket list, is to go to Versailles and just see the palace and see, you know, everything, and see the Hall of Mirrors and just see how beautiful and grand this place is. But if you know the true story of Versailles, you know it was filled with controversy, like the horrific conditions of the people that had to build this fucking thing. Like, people were dying left and right. They didn't even have bathrooms. It was just like a whole bunch of shenanigans. People getting poisoned. They were like the drama of the house. You know, you have Louis XIV with all of his things that he's got going on. He thinks he's the Sun King, like he's the absolute monarch, like nobody has more authority than this dude. And then there's a really interesting dynamic between him and his brother Philip, and his brother Philip, who is also dealing with his homosexuality and all that. So it's a really interesting dynamic how they kind of play the different roles off each other. And I just love in particular what they do with Philip's character, because he is very in touch with his femininity, but yet he's still like a total badass. Like, he will go out there and like wreck people on the battlefield. And I just really like that, because people confuse like masculinity and femininity with bravery, and those two things are not even remotely related. So I really like that portrayal of that character, and there's just a whole bunch of drama, intrigue. So it's very Game of Thrones in that way, where it's like court life and there's a lot of intrigue and whodunit and drama. So it's more like a little bit of mystery, a little bit mystical, a little bit of, you know, seduction and romance and things like that. So that is a very fun show to watch. So the next thing I would recommend if you're jonesing for Game of Thrones, it's not a series like the previous two, it's actually a movie, and it is coming out soon on Netflix if it's not out by the time this video is up. And it is called The Outlaw King, and Chris Pine plays the lead role. He is playing Robert the Bruce. And if you do not know who Robert the Bruce is like the leader of the Scots during about the time of the King Edward, who's known as the Hammer of the Scots. He would go into Scotland, like just basically wrecking their shit, trying to get them to bow down.
They're all thieves. They'll bend the knee or I'll destroy them.
Under Robert the Bruce, the Scots fought for their freedom and kept their own kingdom. So the next show that I recommend watching is not even a movie or a TV show. It's actually a documentary, and it's narrated by Dan Jones, who's a historian. So if you're not into history, just be in it for the eye candy. It's called Britain's Bloody Crown, And it is about the actual real life medieval times and histories that inspired George R.R. Martin to even write Game of Thrones. So it goes through all of the kings during the period that is known to history as the War of the Roses. And that is the period in British medieval history where you have two branches of the house of the Plantagenet kings. You have the house of York, and then you have the house of Lancaster, which are Yorks or like Starks, Lancasters, Lannisters, and their struggle for the crown or the throne of Britain. And the crown changes hands so many times, and there's betrayals and backstabbles and marriages and deaths and all this stuff. And a lot of the characters in Game of Thrones are either lifts straight from, or at least XPs or references to these people that actually lived during this time. So for example, they talk a lot about Henry VI, and he is definitely an XP for the Mad King up until their nickname. Both their nicknames are the Mad King, and the incompetence of both of their reigns causes the downfall of their entire house. Then you have Richard of York, which is a little bit sort of an XP for Ned Stark, because he initially wants to get the crown to kind of protect the kingdom from the crazy king, but then it all goes awry, and then he ends up being named a traitor. And so it kind of sounds familiar if you know season 1 of Game of Thrones. And then he's killed, and then his son feels like he has to take up the mantle of king to try to avenge his father. Edward IV, who shares some traits with Robert Baratheon, is where he's this young king. He comes in, takes the crown from the Mad King. He's young, he's handsome, he's virile, he's all these things, and then over the years he just becomes basically a fat whore. And that is a direct XP for the kind of storyline of Robert Baratheon. And he also has a little bit of Robb Stark in him, whereas he marries Elizabeth Woodville, who is basically an effing nobody. And everyone's pissed because she's a nobody, and her family is basically some upstart social climbers. Well, her family has a lot of shades of the Tyrells, and she ends up marrying the king, and people are not happy about it. So it kind of is similar to Robb Stark when he marries Jane in the books and Talisa in the show, and then shenanigans arrive because they're like, whoa, why are you marrying this broad? Especially when you already gave your word to marry someone else. So there's a lot of Robert Baratheon and Robb Stark in the real life historical figure of Edward IV. Nightfall is another show. It's on Netflix that you can watch. It's about the Knights Templar. So if you ever played the Assassin's Creed series, you kind of know a little bit about them. But if you don't, the Knights Templar are knights who were going and trying to purge the Holy Land during the Crusades, which was when all these kingdoms sent money to these knights and to the Pope so they can have warriors to battle for the area that is known as the Holy Land, which is Jerusalem, Acre, all those places, Damascus, and they were fighting essentially over that territory. So the main character in that series is a guy called Sir Landry, who is a Knights Templar, and they are basically like almost kind of like Jedi in a way, where they don't have women, they just donate themselves to the cause, and they are on a quest for the Holy Grail. And supposedly if you drink out of that cup, you get healing powers or immortality, depending on which legend or lore or whatever you want to believe. That is the legend of the Holy Grail. That show deals with all that, and it's really interesting, and it's pretty cool because it also has some of the court intrigue from Philip IV's court. So 2 bonus shows that I feel will be also really good to watch if you're into Game of Thrones is gonna be Reign and The Tudors. The Tudors actually takes place in the time period historically right before Reign. So The Tudor takes place during the reign of Henry VIII, and Henry VIII is probably the most famous king in all of British history. He is known for having 6 wives, and out of those 6 wives, he divorced 2, beheaded 2, and you know, there's a bunch of shenanigans going on with him and all his wives. Henry VIII in this series in particular is played by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, and I think he is fantastic in this role. Natalie Dormer, who also plays Marjorie Tyrell in Game of Thrones, and in this series in particular, she plays Anne Boleyn. And I felt like their chemistry, like the season that they were in, season 2, like half of season 1, most of season 2 is just phenomenal. Reign takes place directly after the time period of Henry VIII, because his daughter, or a couple years after, because his daughter Elizabeth I is reigning in England, and her cousin, who the show is about, which is Mary, Queen of Scots, living in the French court and all the intrigue and deceit and politicalness and going down in the French court. While Reign is not really historically accurate, I still find it fun, it's still interesting, and the show is kind of one of those CW shows, so if you're into those kind of shows like Riverdale, or it's gonna be in that kind of a vein. So yeah, that was all my shows and movies and series and docu-series that you should watch if you are like me and you cannot wait for Game of Thrones to come back and you're just jonesing for something Game of Thrones-esque, if you will. So don't forget to like this video, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.